He was priced lower than a broken chair, and still no one raised a hand. The auction hall smelled faintly of dust and old timber, the kind that clung to your throat if you stood too long, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a tired hum that made everything feel colder than it should have been, like even the air had given up caring. A row of mismatched items sat under the harsh white glare: tools, crates, rusted farm gear, things people once needed but no longer claimed, and among them, almost hidden at the far end, stood a dog. He didn't bark. He didn't whimper. He simply stood there, still as a fence post in the outback wind, ribs faint beneath his coat, fur dulled by time and neglect. But his eyes didn't belong in a place like this. They were steady, watching, measuring. The auctioneer barely glanced at him, voice flat as he rattled through the listing. Next up, one dog. No papers, no history, starting at $10. And a few people shifted their weight, boots scraping against the concrete floor, but no one stepped forward. Someone near the front muttered under their breath, "Not worth the feed." And another gave a short, humorless chuckle, the kind people use when they've already decided something isn't worth understanding. Outside, a dry wind dragged across the tin roof, rattling it softly, carrying with it the faint scent of eucalyptus and dust, a reminder that the world beyond these walls still moved, still breathed, even if this room felt frozen in its own quiet indifference. At the back of the hall, leaning against a worn wooden post, stood Ethan Walker. Tall, broad across the shoulders, sun-weathered skin that spoke of years spent under harsh skies, and a stillness about him that didn't come from comfort, but from knowing when to wait. His right arm rested loosely by his side, the sleeve of his shirt pulled just enough to reveal the ink etched into his skin. A German shepherd, detailed, lifelike, its gaze almost mirroring the one now standing at the end of the auction line. Ethan didn't move when the dog was brought forward, didn't react when the auctioneer cleared his throat, trying again. $10, anyone? The room stayed quiet. A second passed, then another. But Ethan's eyes had narrowed, not in doubt, but in recognition of something that didn't quite fit. Because the dog wasn't acting like something unwanted. It wasn't shrinking back. It wasn't searching the crowd for kindness. It was assessing. Its ears flicked once, catching a distant sound no one else seemed to notice, and its body shifted ever so slightly, weight balanced, controlled, like it knew exactly where it was and exactly how to stand. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose, the kind of breath a man takes when a memory brushes too close. And for a moment, the noise of the auction faded behind something quieter, something older, like the echo of boots on gravel at dawn, like the silence before a command is given. The dog's gaze moved, just once, cutting through the crowd until it found him. And held. Not pleading, not desperate, just certain, as if out of everyone in that room, there was only one person worth looking at. A chair scraped somewhere to the left, breaking the moment, and the auctioneer let out a short sigh, ready to move on. Right then, if there's no interest, but Ethan had already pushed himself off the post. One step forward. Slow. Deliberate. The kind of step that doesn't ask permission. A few heads turned, curiosity flickering across faces that had already dismissed the animal seconds before, and someone gave a quiet scoff, barely above a whisper, bloody waste of money, but Ethan didn't hear it. Or maybe he did, and it simply didn't matter. Because there was something in the way the dog stood, in the way it refused to fold under the weight of being unwanted, that spoke louder than anything in that room. The distance between them wasn't far, maybe 5 meters, but it felt longer, stretched by silence, by judgment, by everything unsaid, and as Ethan came to a stop just short of the platform, the dog didn't flinch, didn't lower its gaze. It only watched him the same way it had from the beginning, like it already knew, like it had been waiting. The auctioneer paused mid-breath, his hand hovering above the clipboard as if unsure whether to continue or to finally acknowledge the one man who had stepped forward when no one else would. And for a moment the entire room seemed to lean into that hesitation. Boots still, voices gone, even the low hum of the lights fading into something distant and hollow, and Ethan did not rush it. He did not fill the silence. He simply stood there with that same quiet certainty, eyes fixed on the dog as if the rest of the world had already slipped out of focus. The dog shifted its weight once, subtle, controlled, Not the restless movement of something anxious, but the measured adjustment of something aware, something trained to conserve energy, and Ethan noticed the detail immediately. The way the paws placed themselves carefully on the timber platform, the way the spine held straight despite the visible fatigue, the way the head remained level, not submissive, not aggressive, just present. "You serious, mate?" someone called from the side, half amused, half confused, and a few scattered chuckles followed, the kind that carried more dismissal than humor. But Ethan did not turn, did not respond, because there was nothing in that room worth answering except the silence between him and the animal. The auctioneer cleared his throat, voice returning with a practiced rhythm that did not quite hide the curiosity creeping in. "Right then, we have $10, any advance?" But the question floated unanswered, drifting across faces that had already made up their minds, and after a short pause, the gavel came down with a soft, final knock that sounded almost too small for the weight of what had just been decided. "Sold," he said, and just like that, the dog belonged to the only man who had chosen to see it. A few heads shook as people turned back to their own concerns, interest gone as quickly as it had flickered, and the auction moved on, voices rising again, numbers being called, items changing hands. But Ethan remained where he was for another second, just long enough to confirm what he had already felt the moment their eyes met, that this was not chance, not impulse, but recognition. When he stepped closer, the dog did not retreat. It did not lean forward either. It simply held its ground, gaze steady, ears angled slightly forward as if listening not just to Ethan but to everything beyond him. And for the first time, up close, the details became clearer, the faint line of an old collar mark against the fur, the subtle scarring along the flank that spoke not of neglect alone, but of a life lived with purpose. And Ethan's jaw tightened ever so slightly, not in anger, not in pity, but in understanding. "Easy," he murmured, voice low, almost lost beneath the renewed noise of the room, and the dog's ears flicked at the sound. A reaction too precise to be coincidence, too controlled to be instinct alone, and something in Ethan's chest shifted, something quiet but undeniable, like a memory stepping out of shadow. He reached out slowly, not to grab, not to claim, but to offer, his hand stopping just short of contact, giving the animal the space to choose, and for a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the dog moved. Not a step forward, not a gesture of submission, just a slight lowering of the head, enough to acknowledge, enough to accept, and when Ethan's fingers finally brushed against the coarse fur, the contact felt less like meeting something new and more like finding something that had been missing. There was no wagging tail, no sudden display of affection, only stillness, shared and understood, and that stillness spoke louder than anything else could have. Behind them, the auctioneer called out another item, numbers rising again, the rhythm of commerce continuing without pause. But for Ethan, the room had already faded into something distant, replaced by the quiet awareness that this dog was not here by accident, that whatever path had led it to this place had not erased what it once was. "Come on," he said softly, stepping back just enough to create space, and after a brief pause, the dog followed, not hesitating, not lagging, moving with a controlled gait that carried both fatigue and discipline, each step placed with intention, as if the act of walking beside someone was not unfamiliar, only forgotten for a time. As they moved toward the exit, a man near the doorway glanced down at the dog and gave a small shake of his head, muttering something under his breath about wasted money, but Ethan did not slow, did not look back, because he had already seen what the others had missed, and once you saw something like that, you could not unsee it. Outside, the air felt different, cooler, carrying the dry scent of open land and distant trees, and the late afternoon light stretched long shadows across the gravel, painting everything in a softer tone than the harsh white glare inside. And for a moment, Ethan stopped, letting the silence settle around them, letting the noise of the auction fade completely into the background. The dog stood beside him, not pressing close, not drifting away, simply present, and as a Uda rolled past on the dirt road a few meters away, its engine low and steady, the dog's head turned slightly, tracking the sound with a precision that made Ethan's eyes narrow again, not in doubt, but in confirmation. This was no ordinary stray, not even close. He glanced down at the tattoo on his right arm, the inked image of a shepherd that had once meant something different, something tied to memory and loss. And then back at the dog beside him, real, breathing, watching the world with that same unwavering focus. And for the first time since he had stepped into that auction hall, a quiet thought settled in his mind, not loud, not demanding, but certain. This was not a rescue. This was a return. The drive back was quiet in a way that did not feel empty, only unfinished, as if something between them had not yet found the words it needed. And the old Uda rattled steadily along the narrow bitumen road that stretched through dry paddocks and scattered gum trees, the late sun hanging low and casting long shadows that flickered across the windscreen with each passing branch. And Ethan kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the gear stick. Fingers relaxed, but ready, a habit that never quite left him. While beside him, on the worn passenger seat, the dog sat upright without needing to be told, body aligned with the motion of the vehicle, adjusting subtly with every turn, every shift in speed, like it had done this 100 times before. Most dogs would pace, or whine, or press their nose to the window, but this one did none of that. It simply watched, eyes moving not randomly but with purpose, tracking distant movement across the fields, the flicker of a fence line, the sudden lift of birds startled from the grass, and every now and then, its ears would twitch toward a sound too faint for most to notice, and Ethan caught it more than once. The precision, the restraint, the awareness that spoke louder than any command ever could. "You are not what they thought you were," he said quietly, not expecting a response, not needing one, and the dog's gaze shifted briefly toward him, not confused, not reactive, just present, as if acknowledging the tone rather than the words, and that alone told Ethan enough. The road curved gently as they approached a stretch of open land, a few kilometers out from the nearest town, where the air felt cleaner, less crowded, and the hum of the engine settled into something almost rhythmic. And Ethan slowed the Uda slightly, more out of instinct than necessity, because something about the silence had changed. It was subtle, the kind of change most people would miss, but the dog did not. Its posture tightened, not in fear, not in tension, but in focus, head turning slightly toward the roadside where a line of dry scrub met a shallow dip in the earth. And Ethan followed the movement without asking why, his own senses sharpening in response to the shift beside him. He eased the vehicle to a stop on the gravel shoulder, engine idling softly, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then the dog stood, not abruptly, not uncertainly, but with a controlled motion that carried intention, and it stepped down from the seat as soon as Ethan opened the door, landing lightly on the dusty ground, already scanning, already reading something invisible in the air. Ethan closed the door quietly and leaned against the side of the Uda, arms loosely folded, watching, not interfering, because whatever this was, it was not random. The dog moved a few steps forward, nose lowering slightly, not pressing into the dirt like a stray searching for scraps, but hovering just above it, following a line only it could sense, and its pace was measured, deliberate, each step placed with care, and then it stopped. Its ears lifted, its body stilled, and in that stillness, Ethan felt it again, that quiet certainty, that something beneath the surface was being understood without a single word spoken. A faint rustle came from the scrub, barely audible over the breeze, and a small movement followed, subtle, cautious, and the dog did not react with excitement or alarm. It simply held position, watching, assessing, and after a few seconds, a small shape emerged from the dry grass, thin, hesitant, something that had likely learned to move carefully in a world that did not always notice it, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension easing just enough to recognize what was in front of them. The dog did not approach. It did not chase. It simply shifted its stance slightly, creating space, lowering its presence in a way that was not instinctive but intentional, and the small creature paused, uncertain, then moved on, disappearing again into the scrub, and only when it was gone did the dog relax, just enough to signal that whatever had been needed in that moment was done. Ethan pushed himself off the Uda and stepped closer, boots crunching softly against the gravel, and he studied the dog again, this time not as something unknown, but as something revealing itself piece by piece. "You held," he said under his breath, more to himself than to the animal. Because what he had just seen was not chance. It was control. It was judgment. It was a decision made without instruction, without reward, without fear. The dog turned its head slightly toward him, eyes steady. And in that look, there was no need for praise, no expectation of approval, only a quiet acknowledgement that it had done what it believed was right. Ethan let out a slow breath and glanced back toward the open land stretching beyond them, the sun dipping lower now, casting the sky in soft shades of amber and gray. And for a moment, everything felt still, grounded, like the world had shifted just enough to reveal something true beneath the noise. He reached down, resting his hand briefly against the dog's shoulder, not gripping, not guiding, just there, and the contact was accepted without hesitation, without surprise, as if it had always been there. "All right," he said quietly, stepping back toward the Uda, and the dog followed without being called, matching his pace exactly, neither ahead nor behind, just beside. And as they climbed back into the vehicle, the silence returned, but it was no longer unfinished. It was understood. And as the engine carried them forward once more, back along the winding road toward whatever waited ahead, Ethan did not look at the dog again, not because he had stopped noticing, but because he no longer needed to confirm what he already knew. Some things did not need proof. They only needed to be seen. By the time they reached the property, the sky had turned a muted shade of blue-gray, the kind that comes just before the last light disappears and the land settles into its quietest hours. And Ethan slowed the Uda as the gravel track narrowed, tires crunching steadily beneath them while the scent of dry grass and warm earth drifted through the open window, carrying with it the faint hum of insects beginning their night chorus. And the dog remained still beside him, not restless, not uncertain, only attentive, as if mapping every change in sound and space without needing to move. The gate came into view, old timber, slightly weathered, leaning just enough to show its age but still holding firm, and Ethan stepped out without a word, boots hitting the ground with a soft thud as he unlatched it, the metal hinge creaking faintly in the still air, and behind him, the dog waited, not attempting to jump out, not pacing, simply watching, and that patience, that restraint, was not something learned overnight. It was something built over time, something earned. When Ethan swung the gate open and waved him forward, the dog stepped down, landing lightly, eyes scanning the property with the same quiet focus he had shown since the auction, taking in the wide paddocks stretching out for several hundred meters, the low shed to the right, the small weatherboard house ahead, with its porch light already flickering on, casting a soft amber glow that pushed back the encroaching dusk. They walked side by side up the track, no lead, no command, just an unspoken understanding of direction, and the distance between them remained constant, not too close, not too far, as if both knew exactly where the other needed to be. The wind shifted slightly, brushing through the trees at the edge of the property, and the dog's head turned toward it instantly, ears lifting, body adjusting just enough to track the change, and Ethan noticed it again, the way nothing passed unnoticed, the way every detail was accounted for, and he found himself thinking not about what the dog had been through, but about what it had been trained to do, because this was not survival behavior. This was something else entirely. When they reached the house, Ethan stepped onto the wooden porch, the boards creaking softly beneath his weight, and he paused, resting his hand briefly against the doorframe as if grounding himself before stepping inside, a habit he had carried for years. And when he pushed the door open, the familiar scent of timber and faint machine oil greeted him, a mix that spoke of a place lived in, not just occupied. The dog followed, not rushing ahead, not hesitating at the threshold, simply entering as if it understood the boundary without needing it explained. And once inside, it stopped just short of the center of the room, scanning, assessing, taking in the layout with quick, efficient glances, noting the table, the chair, the small shelf along the wall, the doorway leading further inside, and then it settled, not lying down, not relaxing fully, but holding a position that allowed it to see both the entrance and the interior, and Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose, something close to approval but not spoken aloud. "You always pick the right spot, do you?" he murmured, setting his keys down on the table, the metal clinking softly in the stillness, and the dog's ears flicked at the sound, not startled, just aware. Ethan moved toward the kitchen bench, filling a metal bowl with water, the tap running for a few seconds before he shut it off. And he placed the bowl on the floor without calling the dog over, without gesturing, just setting it there and stepping back. And after a brief pause, the dog approached, not rushing, not desperate, lowering its head to drink in steady, controlled movements, not gulping, not spilling, just measured. And Ethan watched quietly, arms folded loosely across his chest, because even something as simple as drinking revealed more than most people would notice. When the dog finished, it stepped back, not lingering, not searching for more, and returned to its previous position, eyes lifting again to the room, and Ethan gave a small nod, almost to himself, as if another piece had just fallen into place. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, brushing against the walls with a low, steady sound, and somewhere in the distance, a gate rattled faintly, just once, carried by the breeze, and the dog's head turned sharply toward the sound, body tensing for a fraction of a second before settling again, not reacting impulsively, only acknowledging. And Ethan followed the glance, his own senses sharpening, because he knew that kind of response, not fear, not curiosity, but readiness. He stepped back onto the porch, the cool air meeting him immediately, and he stood there for a moment, listening, the property stretching out in front of him under the fading light, quiet, familiar, unchanged, and yet something felt different, not in the land, but in the awareness beside him, because now there was another set of eyes, another presence that did not miss what others ignored. The dog moved to stand just behind his right side, not crowding, not taking the lead, simply positioning itself where it could observe both Ethan and the open space beyond. And for a moment, neither of them moved, both listening to the same silence, both reading the same world in different ways. You do not follow commands blindly, do you? Ethan said quietly, more statement than question, and the dog did not respond, not outwardly, but its stillness spoke enough, its presence steady, grounded, certain, and Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting across the paddock where the last light of day faded into shadow, and something settled in him then, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet understanding that this was not about training, not about ownership, but about something far simpler and far rarer. Trust, not given, not forced, only recognized. He stepped back inside, leaving the door slightly open, the night air moving gently through the space, and the dog followed, returning to its place without being told. And as the darkness settled fully over the land, the house remained quiet, not empty, but filled with a presence that did not need to announce itself, because it had already made itself known in the only way that mattered, by choosing when to act, and when not to. The night settled fully over the property with a quiet weight that did not press down, but wrapped around everything, soft and steady, the kind of silence that only comes far from the city where the sky stretches wider and the air carries every small sound just a little further. And inside the house the dim yellow light cast long shadows across the wooden floor, flickering slightly with the movement of the breeze through the open doorway. And Ethan sat at the table with a mug in his hand that had long gone untouched, his eyes not fixed on anything in particular but aware of everything, especially the presence across the room that had not shifted position for nearly 10 minutes. The dog remained exactly where it had chosen to settle earlier, not lying down, not pacing, simply seated with a posture that balanced rest and readiness, head angled just enough to keep both the doorway and Ethan within view. And there was something in that stillness that did not feel like waiting, but like listening, as if the night itself carried information worth paying attention to. A soft creak came from somewhere outside, not loud, not urgent, just the natural settling of wood against cooler air, but the dog's ears lifted instantly, the reaction precise, contained, and Ethan noticed it without turning his head, because he had begun to understand that nothing this animal did was accidental. "You hear everything, do you?" he said quietly, his voice low and even, and the dog did not move, but the slight shift in its breathing, the barely noticeable adjustment in posture, was enough to confirm awareness, and Ethan gave a faint nod to himself, setting the mug down with a soft tap against the table. Time passed in a way that felt both slow and purposeful, the kind of time where nothing obvious happens but everything important is revealed, and eventually Ethan stood, moving toward the back of the house where a small cupboard held an old tin box, worn at the edges, its surface scratched from years of being opened and closed. And when he lifted the lid, the faint scent of metal and paper rose into the air, carrying with it something older than the house itself. Inside were a few items, not many, but each one placed with care, and among them, a small, faded tag attached to a strip of worn leather, the kind used for working dogs, the kind that held more meaning than its appearance suggested, and Ethan held it in his hand for a moment, thumb brushing lightly over the engraved surface, before he closed the lid again and returned to the main room. The dog watched him the entire time, not curiously, not intrusively, just aware, and when Ethan stepped back into the light, he paused, looking at the animal as if seeing not just what stood in front of him, but what stood behind it, what had shaped it, what had not been erased despite everything that had happened since. "Let us try something," he said quietly, not raising his voice, not commanding, just offering, and he moved a few steps closer, stopping at a distance that allowed space but invited attention, and then, without gesture, without force, he spoke a single word, soft, deliberate, carried more by tone than by volume. The dog did not react immediately. It did not jump, did not move, did not perform. Instead, it held still, eyes fixed on Ethan, processing, weighing, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, it shifted its stance, not completing the command, not rejecting it either, but choosing something in between, something that felt less like obedience and more like judgment, and Ethan felt it in that moment. The difference between a dog that follows and a dog that decides. A faint breath escaped him, not frustration, not surprise, but recognition, and he gave a small nod, stepping back again, because whatever this was, it was not broken behavior, it was intentional, and that mattered more than compliance ever could. Outside, the wind picked up, slightly, brushing through the trees with a low, continuous sound, and somewhere in the distance, a loose sheet of metal tapped rhythmically against something unseen, a hollow, uneven beat that blended into the night, and the dog's attention shifted again, not sharply, not urgently, but with that same controlled awareness, tracking the pattern, separating it from the rest of the noise, and Ethan followed the glance this time, his own instincts aligning with the dog's in a way that felt both familiar and new. He stepped toward the doorway, pausing just before crossing the threshold, and for a moment, he listened, not with his ears alone, but with that quiet sense that had kept him alive in places far harsher than this, and behind him, the dog rose, not rushing, not crowding, simply standing, ready if needed, still if not. The sound came again, slightly different now, not just the wind, something else layered beneath it, subtle, uncertain, and Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly, not alarmed, but focused, and then he did something simple, something small, something that did not look like much at all. He stepped aside, not forward, not back, just aside, creating space, and the dog understood immediately. It moved past him without hesitation, not charging, not hesitating, simply stepping into the position that had been offered, its body aligned with the doorway, its gaze fixed outward into the darkness, and for a moment, the two of them stood like that, one slightly behind, one slightly ahead, not as master and animal, but as something closer to equals, each aware of the other, each trusting the other to see what they might miss alone. The night stretched out before them, quiet, vast, carrying the faint scent of earth and distant water, and whatever had shifted in the air began to settle again, the irregular sound fading back into the steady rhythm of wind and stillness, and after a few seconds, the dog eased its posture, not fully relaxing, but lowering the edge of its readiness just enough to signal that the moment had passed. Ethan let out a slow breath and stepped forward again, his shoulder brushing lightly against the dog as he returned to stand beside it, and he reached down, not to command, not to guide, but simply to rest his hand briefly against the side of its neck, and the contact was accepted without question, without hesitation, as if it had always been there. "You choose," he said quietly, more to himself than to the dog, and there was no need for an answer, because it had already been given in every movement, every pause, every decision made without being told, and as they stood there in the doorway, looking out over the darkened land, the silence between them no longer felt like something waiting to be filled, but something already complete. The hours moved quietly after that, not marked by clocks or words, but by the slow rhythm of the land settling deeper into night, and Ethan remained by the doorway longer than he realized, his shoulder just brushing the frame, the cool air brushing against his skin, while beside him the dog stood with the same steady presence. No impatience, no restlessness, only that quiet awareness that seemed to reach further than sight alone. Eventually, Ethan stepped back inside, the timber floor creaking softly beneath his boots, and without turning, he knew the dog would follow, not because it was told, but because it had already chosen to stay. The door remained open, just enough to let the night breathe through the house, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant water, and Ethan moved toward the small shelf along the wall where an old radio sat, its surface worn smooth from years of use. And he turned the dial slowly until a faint signal came through, low and steady, voices blending into static, not loud enough to fill the room, just enough to remind him that the world outside still existed beyond the silence. The dog did not react to the sound in the way most would. It did not tilt its head in confusion or curiosity. Instead, its ears adjusted slightly, filtering, separating the human voices from the background noise, and then it settled again, having decided the sound held no threat, no importance. Ethan watched that small shift from the corner of his eye, another detail added to a pattern that was becoming harder to ignore. "You do not waste attention," he murmured, voice low, almost thoughtful, and the dog remained still, but there was something in its posture that suggested understanding, not of the words, but of the tone, the weight behind them. He moved toward the table again, pulling out a chair and sitting down with a quiet exhale, elbows resting loosely on the worn surface, hands clasped together as his gaze drifted across the room, not searching, not analyzing, just present, and for a while, nothing happened. The kind of nothing that reveals more than action ever could. Outside, the wind eased slightly, the steady brush against the trees softening into something gentler, and the distant tapping sound that had drawn their attention earlier faded completely, replaced by the low hum of night insects and the occasional distant call of something moving through the paddock. The dog shifted then, but only slightly, lowering itself from its seated position into a resting one, not fully relaxed, still angled toward the doorway, still aware, but allowing a fraction of its guard to drop, and Ethan noticed the exact moment it happened, the subtle change in breathing, the slight release in the shoulders, and he understood it for what it was. Trust, not given freely, but allowed in small, measured increments. He leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking softly beneath him, and his gaze settled on the dog for the first time in several minutes, not studying, not questioning, just observing. And in that quiet observation, something else surfaced, something older than the night, older than the property, something tied to memory. "You have been told before," he said after a moment, his voice calm, steady, "to do things that did not feel right." And the words hung in the air, not heavy, not demanding an answer, just present, and the dog did not react immediately. It did not shift, did not look away, did not show anything obvious at all, and yet, there was a pause, a stillness within the stillness, as if something deeper had been acknowledged, something not easily seen but felt all the same. Ethan exhaled slowly and nodded once, not expecting confirmation, not needing it, because he had already seen enough. He stood then, moving toward the back of the house where a folded blanket lay on a small bench, worn but clean, and he picked it up, carrying it back into the main room before placing it on the floor near the wall, not directly beside him, not too far either, just a space offered, not assigned. The dog watched the movement, eyes following the placement of the blanket, but did not move immediately, and Ethan did not call it over, did not gesture, simply stepping back and returning to his chair, leaving the choice open. A minute passed, then another, and then, without any prompt, the dog rose, crossing the room in a quiet, controlled walk, each step deliberate, measured, and it approached the blanket, pausing just at the edge as if assessing the offer, and then it lowered itself onto it, not curling tightly, not collapsing into rest, but settling in a way that kept its line of sight clear, both the doorway and Ethan still within view. Ethan watched the movement without comment, but there was a faint shift in his expression, something softer, something less guarded, and he reached for the mug again, lifting it this time, taking a slow sip even though the drink had gone cool, because the act itself mattered more than the warmth. "That will do," he said quietly, and the dog's ears flicked once at the sound, not in alert, but in acknowledgement, and then it rested its head just slightly lower, not fully down, not fully relaxed, but closer than before. The radio murmured softly in the background. The wind moved gently through the open door, and the house held that same quiet presence, no longer unfamiliar, no longer uncertain, just shared. And as the night stretched on, neither of them felt the need to fill the silence, because what needed to be understood had already begun to take shape, not through commands, not through force, but through something far simpler: the freedom to choose and the willingness to recognize it. The night did not break, it deepened, folding itself around the house in layers of quiet that felt almost deliberate, and sometime between the soft murmur of the radio and the steady rhythm of his own breathing, Ethan must have drifted into a light sleep in the chair, not fully gone. Never fully unaware, the kind of rest that comes to men who have learned to listen even with their eyes closed. It was not a loud sound that brought him back, not a crash, not a call, just a change, subtle, precise, the kind of shift that does not belong to noise but to absence. The radio had gone silent, not turned off, just lost signal, the faint static replaced by nothing at all. Ethan's eyes opened slowly, no sudden movement, no confusion, just awareness returning in a single breath, and before he even looked around the room, he felt it. The stillness had changed. Across the room, the dog was no longer resting. It was standing, not tense, not alarmed, just standing, head angled slightly toward the open doorway, ears lifted, body aligned in that same controlled readiness Ethan had come to recognize. "You felt it too," Ethan said quietly, his voice low enough not to disturb the silence further, and he pushed himself up from the chair without rushing, every movement measured, deliberate, because whatever this was, it did not call for panic, only attention. The air inside the house had shifted, cooler now, the breeze coming through the doorway carrying a different scent, something faint, something unfamiliar but not immediately threatening, and the dog stepped forward one pace, then stopped, waiting, not for instruction, but for alignment. Ethan moved beside it, not ahead, not behind, just beside, and together they stood at the threshold, looking out into the darkened paddock where the shapes of trees and fence lines blurred into shadow under a sky scattered with cold stars. The land looked the same, quiet, still, but the silence had weight now, a subtle tension that sat just beneath the surface, and Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly, not searching for movement, but listening for intention. A faint sound came from the far side of the property, barely more than a whisper carried on the wind, a soft dragging noise against the ground, irregular, cautious, and the dog's ears adjusted instantly, locking onto the direction with precision, its body shifting just enough to align with the source, and Ethan followed without question, because he trusted that response more than his own sight. "Easy," he murmured, not as a command, but as a shared understanding, and he stepped forward onto the porch, boots meeting the wood with a soft creak that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness, and the dog moved with him, not overtaking, not hesitating, simply matching his pace exactly. They paused at the edge of the steps, both listening, both reading the same quiet space in different ways, and the sound came again, slightly clearer now, not aggressive, not urgent, but present, and Ethan felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not fear, but focus, the kind that sharpens everything else into place. He stepped down onto the ground, the gravel crunching softly beneath his weight, and the dog followed without needing to be called, its movement silent despite its size, controlled in a way that spoke of training that had never been forgotten. They moved a few meters forward, not rushing, not closing the distance too quickly, and then Ethan stopped. Not because he saw something, but because the dog did. Its posture shifted, not forward, not back, but grounded, anchored, and its head lowered just slightly, not in submission, but in observation, and Ethan held his position, trusting the pause, trusting the judgment being made beside him. Another faint movement came from the darkness ahead, and this time, it was followed by something else. A sound, soft, uncertain, not a threat, not a warning, just presence. The dog did not advance. It did not retreat. It simply adjusted its stance, creating space, the same way it had done earlier by the roadside, lowering its intensity without losing awareness, and Ethan understood immediately what that meant. This was not something to confront. This was something to allow. He shifted his weight slightly, easing the line of his shoulders, stepping half a pace to the side, opening the space further, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the edge of the shadow, a small shape emerged, hesitant, careful, drawn not by force but by the absence of it, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension easing just enough to let the moment settle. The dog remained still, its eyes tracking the movement. Without fixation, without pressure, simply present, and when the small shape moved past the boundary of shadow into the faint light spilling from the house, it paused, sensing no threat, no pursuit, only the quiet allowance of space. And then it continued, slipping along the edge of the paddock and disappearing again into the night. Silence returned. Not the same silence as before. Softer, lighter, the kind that follows understanding. Ethan stood there for a few seconds longer, his gaze resting on the space where the movement had been, and then he glanced down at the dog, not questioning, not testing, just acknowledging, and the dog met his gaze briefly, steady, unchanged, as if to say there had never been another option. Ethan gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and turned back toward the house, stepping up onto the porch again, the boards creaking softly beneath him, and the dog followed without hesitation, returning to its place beside him, not ahead, not behind. Inside, the radio crackled faintly as the signal returned, voices bleeding back into static, and the room felt the same as before, but not quite, as if something unseen had shifted just enough to change the weight of it. Ethan closed the door partway this time, not fully, just enough to quiet the wind, and he moved back to the chair, lowering himself into it with a slow breath, his eyes lingering on the dog for a moment longer before settling into the familiar stillness once again. The dog returned to the blanket, lowering itself with that same measured control, not collapsing into rest, but allowing it in degrees, its head angled toward the doorway, its awareness still present even as its body eased. And in that quiet, shared space, nothing more needed to be said, because what had been proven did not need explanation. Not every decision is taught. Some are chosen, and those are the ones that matter. Morning did not arrive with noise. It arrived with light, thin and pale at first, slipping through the edges of the window and stretching slowly across the wooden floor like something careful not to disturb what had settled overnight. And Ethan was already awake before the sun fully rose, not because something had pulled him from sleep, but because he had never truly fallen into it, his body resting while his awareness stayed close to the surface. And as he sat there in the chair, eyes open, breathing steady, he noticed the first thing that mattered. The dog had not moved from the blanket, not in a way that broke its line of awareness. It had shifted during the night. That much was clear from the slight change in position, but its orientation remained the same, angled toward the doorway, angled toward the world outside, as if even rest had been chosen with purpose. The radio had gone quiet again, not from signal loss this time, but because Ethan had turned it off at some point he did not remember, and the house now held only the natural sounds of morning beginning. A faint breeze brushing against the walls, the distant call of birds waking somewhere beyond the paddock, and the soft, steady rhythm of breathing that came from the dog across the room. Ethan stood slowly, joints adjusting, muscles easing back into motion, and he stepped toward the doorway, pushing it open fully this time, letting the cool morning air roll in, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and eucalyptus, fresher than the night, cleaner somehow, and he stood there for a moment, letting it settle into his chest before moving further out onto the porch. The land stretched out before him in soft light, the outlines of fences and trees becoming clearer as the sun lifted higher, and everything looked unchanged, quiet, stable, the way it always had been, and yet Ethan felt the difference again, not in the land, but in the presence behind him. The dog rose without sound, stepping off the blanket in a controlled motion that did not rush the morning, did not break its stillness, and it moved to the doorway, stopping just behind Ethan's right side, not crowding, not overtaking, simply placing itself where it could see what he saw, and for a while, neither of them moved. The breeze shifted slightly, carrying a new layer of scent across the paddock, and the dog's head tilted just a fraction, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough for Ethan to notice, enough for him to understand that something had been registered, something small, something distant, and he followed the direction of the dog's gaze without asking why. "Go on," Ethan said quietly, not as an order, not as a command, just as permission, and this time, the dog moved ahead. Not fast, not eager, just forward, stepping off the porch and onto the gravel, its body aligned with intention, each movement deliberate, and Ethan remained where he was, watching, not interfering, because whatever the dog was responding to, it was not something that required control. The distance between them grew to several meters as the dog moved across the yard, nose lifting slightly, not pressed to the ground, but sampling the air, following a line invisible to anyone else. And its pace remained steady, unbroken, until it reached the edge of the paddock where the grass grew taller and the ground dipped slightly toward a shallow run of earth. There it stopped, not abruptly, not uncertainly, just still. Ethan stepped down from the porch and followed at a distance, boots crunching softly against the gravel before transitioning to the softer sound of dry grass underfoot. And as he approached, he slowed, not wanting to disrupt the moment, not wanting to impose movement where stillness had already been chosen. The dog remained fixed in place, eyes focused on a point just beyond the visible line of grass, ears angled forward, body balanced, and Ethan came to a stop a few meters behind, his gaze settling on the same area, waiting, not forcing the reveal. A few seconds passed, then a minute, and then, slowly, something shifted within the grass. Not sudden, not sharp, just a gentle movement, cautious, measured, and the dog did not advance, did not press forward. It simply held its position, maintaining the same space it had created the night before, allowing whatever was there to choose its own path. Ethan exhaled quietly, recognizing the pattern, recognizing the intention, and then he saw it. A small form, barely visible at first, emerging from the grass with hesitant steps, not drawn by command, not driven by fear, but by the absence of threat, and the dog remained exactly where it was, not moving, not claiming, simply present. The moment stretched, quiet and balanced, and then the small form moved past, slipping through the edge of the paddock and continuing on its way, undisturbed, unchallenged, and as it disappeared, the tension that had never quite formed dissolved completely, leaving behind only the steady calm of morning. The dog eased its posture then, just slightly, not collapsing into relaxation, but releasing the edge of its focus, and it turned its head back toward Ethan, not seeking approval, not asking for direction, just acknowledging the shared moment, and Ethan gave a small nod, the kind that carries understanding without needing words. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and for the first time since the night before, he reached down and let his hand rest fully against the dog's neck, not brief, not passing, but steady, and the dog accepted it without hesitation, without tension, its body remaining grounded, present, and in that contact, something settled that had been building since the auction, something quiet, something certain. "You see what matters," Ethan said softly, and the words were not a test, not a question, just a statement of fact. And as the morning light spread further across the land, warming the ground, lifting the shadows, the two of them stood there at the edge of the paddock, not as strangers anymore, not even as partners in the usual sense, but as something simpler. Two beings who understood the difference between reacting and choosing. And once you understand that, you do not need to be told what to do next. The sun had climbed higher by the time they turned back toward the house, its light now warmer, stretching across the paddock in long golden lines that softened every edge and made even the worn fence posts look like they still had purpose left in them. And Ethan walked at an easy pace, not leading, not following, simply moving, while the dog stayed beside him without needing to check, without needing to adjust, its stride matching his naturally as if that rhythm had always existed between them. The morning air carried more sound now. The distant hum of a vehicle several kilometers away, the sharp call of a magpie from the far tree line, the faint rustle of wind moving through dry grass, and the dog registered each one without reacting, its ears shifting subtly, filtering, prioritizing, deciding what mattered and what did not, and Ethan noticed the pattern again. The same quiet discipline that could not be taught in a single place or a single time. When they reached the porch, Ethan paused before stepping up, his gaze drifting across the land once more, not searching for anything specific, just taking in the space with that same measured awareness. And the dog stopped beside him, not because it had to, but because it chose to remain aligned. And for a brief moment, the two of them stood there in silence, the morning settling around them like something complete. "You have done this before," Ethan said quietly, not as a question, not expecting confirmation, but stating what had already become clear, and the dog did not respond outwardly, but its stillness carried a weight that made the words feel answered anyway. He stepped inside then, the boards creaking softly beneath his boots, and moved toward the bench where a small tin sat, the same one he had opened the night before, and this time, he lifted the lid again, slower, more deliberate, as if the act itself held more meaning now, and he reached inside, retrieving the worn leather strip with the faded tag attached, holding it between his fingers for a moment before turning back toward the room. The dog had followed him in, stopping at the same place it had chosen earlier, its body angled to keep both Ethan and the doorway within view. But when Ethan held the tag out slightly, not close, not forcing the interaction, the dog's attention shifted immediately, not curious, not reactive, but focused in a way that was deeper than simple recognition. It stepped forward once, then paused, head lowering slightly as it looked at the object in Ethan's hand. And for the first time since the auction, there was a change. Small, almost invisible, but there. A flicker of something behind the eyes that had not been there before. Ethan did not move closer. He did not speak. He simply held the space, letting the moment unfold without pressure. And, after a few seconds, the dog stepped closer again, slow, controlled, until it was within reach of the tag, and it leaned in just enough for its nose to brush lightly against the worn leather. The contact was brief, deliberate, and then the dog pulled back, not retreating, just resetting its position, but the air had shifted. Something had surfaced. Something remembered. Ethan exhaled slowly, his grip on the tag tightening just slightly before easing again, and he lowered his hand, not pushing further, because whatever connection had just been made did not need to be forced into something larger. "You remember," he said softly, and the words carried no demand, no expectation, only recognition, and the dog held his gaze for a moment longer than before, steady, grounded, as if acknowledging not the object, but the understanding behind it. Outside, the wind picked up briefly, brushing against the walls with a low, steady sound, and somewhere in the distance, a gate rattled once, sharp and clear in the morning air, and the dog's ears flicked instantly toward it, its body shifting slightly, not alarmed, not tense, just ready, and Ethan followed the movement, the moment of connection folding naturally back into awareness, into the present. "We will see," he murmured, placing the tag back on the bench, not returning it to the tin, leaving it where it could be seen, where it could remain part of the space rather than hidden away, and he stepped back toward the doorway again, the dog already moving beside him without needing to be called. The paddock stretched out ahead, unchanged but somehow different now that it was being seen by more than one set of eyes that understood it, and Ethan stepped down onto the gravel, the sound grounding, familiar, and the dog followed, its posture aligning once more with the open space, with the land, with the quiet responsibility that seemed to come naturally to it. They moved together across the yard, not toward anything specific, just walking the boundary, the way Ethan often did in the mornings, checking fences, checking gates, checking nothing in particular, but everything at once, and the dog mirrored the pattern without instruction. Its path weaving slightly, adjusting, observing, creating a wider field of awareness without breaking the shared direction. A few minutes passed like that, silent, steady, and then Ethan slowed, stopping near the far fence where the ground dipped slightly and the grass grew uneven, and he rested his hand on the top rail, looking out over the land beyond, and the dog stopped beside him, not scanning now, not actively searching, just present. "They thought you were nothing," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying across the open space without force, and he glanced down at the dog, not expecting a reaction, not needing one, because the truth of it was already understood, not just by him, but by the way the dog carried itself, by the way it chose its actions instead of reacting blindly. The breeze moved through again, softer now, carrying the warmth of the rising sun, and for a moment, everything felt settled, balanced, as if the pieces that needed to come together had already begun to find their place. Ethan gave a small nod to himself and pushed off the fence, turning back toward the house, and the dog followed without hesitation, not because it had been told, but because it had already decided that this was where it belonged, not as something owned, not as something rescued, but as something recognized. And that made all the difference. The day stretched forward with a quiet steadiness that did not demand attention, only presence, and by late morning the sun had settled into a clear blue sky, casting sharp shadows across the paddock where the grass moved in slow waves under a light breeze, and Ethan worked along the fence line with the same measured rhythm he had carried for years, checking wire tension, adjusting a loose post. Nothing urgent, nothing broken, just the small acts that keep a place standing, and not once did he look back to see if the dog followed, because he already knew. It was there. Not close enough to interfere, not far enough to disappear, moving in a wider arc that covered ground Ethan did not need to step on, its path weaving naturally, eyes scanning, ears shifting, the same quiet system unfolding without instruction, and every now and then, the dog would pause, not because something was wrong, but because something needed to be understood, and Ethan let those pauses happen, never calling it back, never questioning the space it chose to create. A Uda passed along the distant road, its engine a low hum carried faintly across the open land, and the dog's head lifted briefly, tracking the sound, confirming its direction, and then it let it go, returning to the quiet task of awareness, and Ethan noticed the sequence without turning, because by now, the pattern had settled into something predictable, something reliable. "You do not chase noise," he said under his breath, tightening a length of wire with a slow pull, and the words felt less like observation and more like agreement, as if he was recognizing a rule they both followed. By midday, the heat had begun to build, not harsh, but present, the kind that sits on your shoulders and reminds you to slow your pace. And Ethan stepped back from the fence, rolling his shoulders once before wiping his hands against his trousers, and he glanced out across the paddock where the dog stood several meters away, positioned just off the main line of movement, its body angled toward a section of land Ethan had not yet checked, and he followed the direction of its stance, narrowing his eyes slightly. There was nothing obvious. No broken wire. No open gate. Just a subtle difference in the way the grass lay, a slight disturbance that might have gone unnoticed if not for the way the dog held its attention there, not tense, not alert, just focused, and Ethan walked toward it without haste, closing the distance in a straight, calm line, and when he reached the spot, he saw it. A section of fencing, still upright, still intact, but the lower wire had loosened just enough to create a narrow gap, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, and Ethan crouched down, running his hand along the wire, feeling the give, the slight shift that would have widened over time if left alone. He let out a slow breath and gave a small nod, not surprised, just confirming, and he glanced at the dog, which had already shifted its stance slightly, not claiming credit, not seeking acknowledgement, just adjusting to the next moment as if the previous one had already passed. "You saw it before I did," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying no pride, no surprise, just truth, and he reached for the tools at his belt, working the wire back into place with steady, practiced movements, tightening it until the line held firm again, and when he stood, the fence looked no different from before, but it would hold now, it would last, and that was enough. The dog had already moved on, not lingering, not watching the repair, because its role was not to fix, only to notice, and Ethan followed its path with his eyes, seeing the way it continued along the boundary, covering ground that did not need his hands, only awareness, and something in his chest settled deeper, something that had been building since the moment in the auction hall, something that now had shape. "You were not discarded," he said under his breath, turning back toward the house, the words quiet, almost lost to the breeze. "You were misunderstood," and the dog did not turn at the sound, did not pause, but its ears flicked once, a small acknowledgement that was easy to miss if you were not paying attention. The afternoon moved slowly after that, the kind of slow that does not drag but unfolds, and by the time Ethan returned to the house, the light had softened again, shadows lengthening across the yard, and he stepped onto the porch with a familiar ease, pushing the door open with his shoulder before setting a glass of water on the table, the surface catching the light in a way that made it look almost still despite the slight ripple from movement. The dog entered a few seconds later, not following directly, but finishing its own path first, stepping inside only when it had completed what it had chosen to do, and it returned to the same space near the wall, not out of habit, but because it allowed the best view, the best awareness, and Ethan did not comment on it, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to guide. He leaned against the bench, arms resting loosely, and for a moment, he simply watched, not analyzing, not testing, just observing the quiet presence that had integrated itself into the rhythm of the place without disruption, without demand. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of dust and distant trees, and the house held steady around them, timber and air and silence, and Ethan reached out, resting his hand briefly against the back of a chair, grounding himself in the moment before letting his gaze settle once more on the dog. "Some things are not meant to follow," he said softly, more to the room than to the animal. "They are meant to choose." And the dog remained still, its breathing steady, its posture unchanged, but there was something in the way it held itself, something in the quiet certainty of its presence that made the words feel complete. And as the afternoon eased toward evening, the space between them no longer felt like distance at all, but like understanding, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be real. Evening came slower that day, as if the land itself was in no hurry to let the light go, and the sky stretched wide above the paddock in long bands of pale gold and soft blue, fading gently toward the horizon where the trees stood dark and still, and Ethan remained on the porch longer than usual, one hand resting against the timber post, the other hanging loose by his side, his gaze drifting across the property not to check, not to measure, but simply to see. The dog lay a few meters away, not on the blanket this time, but directly on the wooden boards where the last warmth of the day still lingered, its body relaxed in a way that had not been possible the night before, yet its head remained lifted, angled slightly toward the open space beyond the yard, ears moving occasionally as the evening sounds settled into place. There was a difference now, subtle but clear, the kind of difference that does not announce itself but becomes undeniable once noticed. The space between them had changed, not smaller, not closer, just steadier. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath carrying something that felt lighter than it had in a long time, and he stepped down from the porch, boots meeting the ground with a soft crunch that did not disturb the quiet, and the dog's eyes followed the movement without rising, without shifting its position, only tracking, only aware. "Stay," Ethan said, not as a command, not with force, just a word placed into the air, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the dog lowered its head slightly, not fully resting it, but easing its posture in a way that acknowledged the word without surrendering its awareness, and Ethan gave a small nod, more to himself than to the dog, before turning and walking toward the far edge of the yard. The distance between them grew slowly, 10 meters, then 20, then more, and Ethan did not look back, not once, because this was not about testing obedience, it was about understanding choice. The wind moved softly through the grass, carrying with it the scent of evening cooling the land, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called once before settling into silence, and Ethan walked until he reached the same fence line he had checked earlier, resting his hands lightly on the top rail as he looked out beyond it, the world stretching quiet and open in front of him. He stood there for a long moment, not moving, not calling, simply waiting, and behind him, back at the house, the dog remained where it had been, its body still, its awareness steady, and though the distance separated them physically, the connection between them did not shift, did not weaken, it simply held. After a while, Ethan turned slightly, not fully, just enough to bring the house into his peripheral view, and he saw the dog exactly where he had left it. No movement, no hesitation, just presence, and something in his chest settled deeper than before, something that did not need confirmation but received it anyway. "Good," he said quietly, the word carried by the breeze but not directed at anything in particular, and he turned back toward the land, letting the silence stretch once more. Time passed in that quiet way that feels longer than it is, and eventually, Ethan stepped away from the fence, turning back toward the house with the same steady pace, not rushing, not calling ahead. And as he crossed the yard, the dog lifted its head slightly higher, tracking his return, but it did not rise immediately. It did not break the stillness. Until he was within a few meters, and only then did it stand, not out of urgency, not out of excitement, but because the moment had shifted. Ethan reached the base of the porch and paused, looking at the dog for a brief second, not analyzing, not measuring, just seeing. And then he stepped up onto the boards, and the dog followed a moment later, returning to its place without needing direction, without needing permission. Inside, the house held the same quiet it always had, but it no longer felt empty, no longer carried the weight of something missing. And Ethan moved to the table, resting his hands against the surface as he looked down at the worn wood, the grain marked by years of use, by time, by presence. The dog settled again near the doorway, its body angled as it always chose, its awareness still intact even as its posture eased, and Ethan let out a slow breath, his shoulders dropping slightly, as if something he had been carrying had finally been set down without him realizing it. "You do not wait for orders," he said softly, his voice low, steady. "You wait for meaning." And the words did not feel like a revelation, only a recognition of something that had been there from the beginning, something everyone else had missed because they were looking for obedience instead of understanding. Outside, the last light of the day faded into a deepening blue, the sky shifting slowly as the first stars began to appear, and the wind softened to almost nothing, leaving the air still and clear. And inside the house, the quiet settled fully, not empty, not heavy, just complete. Ethan moved to the doorway once more, standing there with one hand resting against the frame, and the dog did not follow this time, did not rise, only watched, its presence steady, grounded. And in that moment, there was no need for movement, no need for action, because what needed to be proven had already been shown in the simplest way possible. Not through force, not through command, but through the choice to stay, even when nothing was asked. The night returned again, but it did not feel the same as the one before. It arrived softer, less uncertain, as if the land itself had accepted the presence that now moved within it. And the house held that quiet warmth that only comes when something unspoken has settled into place. Ethan remained by the doorway for a while longer, watching the last traces of light dissolve into a deep blue sky, his posture relaxed but never careless, one hand resting against the frame, the other hanging loosely at his side. And behind him, the dog did not move, not because it was told to stay, but because there was no reason to leave. The silence between them was no longer something to be measured. It simply existed, steady, grounded, complete. A faint breeze moved through the open doorway, brushing against the floorboards, carrying with it the scent of cooling earth and distant trees. And somewhere far across the paddock, a gate shifted slightly, the sound soft but distinct in the stillness, and the dog's ears lifted, not sharply, not urgently, just enough to acknowledge, and then settled again when nothing followed. Ethan noticed it without turning. He always did now, not because he was watching the dog, but because he had begun to trust what the dog noticed. He stepped back inside slowly, the boards creaking beneath his weight, and this time, he closed the door gently, not fully, just enough to quiet the wind, leaving a narrow gap where the night could still breathe through. The dog remained where it was for a moment longer, then shifted its position slightly, not moving closer, not retreating, simply adjusting to the new boundary, its awareness aligning with the space as it always did. And Ethan let out a quiet breath, something almost like a release, though he had not realized he was holding anything to begin with. He moved toward the table, his fingers brushing lightly against the worn surface, and his eyes settled on the small tag he had left there earlier, the faded metal catching the faint light from the lamp. And he stood there for a moment, not reaching for it, just looking, as if the object no longer needed to be held to be understood. Behind him, the dog lowered itself onto the floor again, not on the blanket this time, but closer to the doorway, its body angled just enough to keep the entrance within view. And its breathing slowed, steady, even, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to question. "You chose well," Ethan said quietly, the words barely more than a breath, Not directed at the dog, not directed at himself, just placed into the room as something true, and the dog did not respond outwardly, but its stillness carried that same quiet acknowledgement it always had. Time passed without being counted, the kind of time that slips by unnoticed because nothing needs to be marked, and eventually Ethan moved to the chair again, sitting down with a slow exhale, his shoulders easing as he leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the doorway where the dog rested. The lamp cast a soft glow across the room, shadows stretching and shifting with the movement of the air, and outside, the night settled deeper, the distant sounds fading into something softer, something more distant, until only the quiet remained. Ethan watched the dog for a while, not studying, not analyzing, just observing the presence that had become part of the space without disrupting it, and something in his chest felt lighter, steadier, as if a weight he had carried without noticing had finally found its place. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, and after a moment, he spoke again, his voice low, calm, steady. "They would have called you difficult," he said, his eyes still on the dog. "Uncooperative, unreliable." And he paused briefly, letting the words settle before continuing. "But they were looking for obedience, not judgment." The dog did not move, did not lift its head, but there was a subtle shift in its breathing, a small change that spoke of awareness, and Ethan gave a faint nod, as if confirming something that no longer needed to be proven. Outside, the wind eased further, the air growing still, and the house seemed to hold its breath in that quiet moment, as if everything within it had aligned. Ethan leaned back again, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling, then back to the doorway, and he let the silence settle fully, not filling it, not breaking it, just allowing it to be what it was. After a while, he stood once more, moving toward the doorway with slow, deliberate steps, and he paused just beside the dog, looking down at it for a moment, not as something separate, but as something already understood. He reached down then, his hand resting gently against the dog's shoulder, not brief this time, not passing, but steady, and the dog accepted it without hesitation, without tension, its body remaining grounded, present, and in that contact, something final settled between them, something that did not need words, did not need explanation. Ethan withdrew his hand slowly and stepped back, his gaze lingering for just a second longer before he turned away, moving toward the back of the house as the lamp cast his shadow long across the floor, and the dog remained where it was, not following, not needing to, because the space between them no longer required movement to be maintained. And as the night deepened fully around the house, wrapping it in quiet and stillness, there was nothing left to question, nothing left to prove, because what had been missed by others had been seen, and once something is truly seen, it does not need to be explained. It simply is. The night carried them gently into stillness, but morning returned with something different, not urgency, not noise, just clarity, the kind that settles in without asking permission. And when the first light touched the edge of the doorway, Ethan was already awake, standing where he had been the evening before, one hand resting against the frame, his posture relaxed in a way that no longer felt temporary. And the house behind him held that same quiet presence, unchanged yet entirely different. The dog had not moved far during the night, only enough to adjust, only enough to rest without losing awareness. And as the light grew stronger, it lifted its head slowly, not startled, not reactive, just aware that a new day had begun, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the silence stretching between them not as distance, but as something shared. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, the boards warm beneath his feet from the early sun, and the land opened before him again, wide and steady, the same paddock, the same fences, the same trees, but seen now through a different understanding, and behind him, the dog rose and followed, not immediately, not hurried, just when it chose to, stepping into place beside him as if the decision had already been made long before the movement itself. They stood there for a while, looking out over the land, the breeze light, the air clean, and Ethan let out a slow breath, something close to relief, though he had not been searching for it, and he reached down, resting his hand briefly against the dog's neck, not testing, not confirming, just acknowledging what had already settled between them. "We are done proving anything," he said quietly, the words simple, steady, and the dog remained still beside him, its presence unchanged, its awareness intact. And in that stillness, the meaning of the words did not need to be answered. It was already understood. They moved together then, not toward a task, not toward a problem, just into the day, walking the edge of the yard with the same quiet rhythm that had formed without effort, Ethan checking what needed to be checked, the dog observing what needed to be seen, and there was no overlap, no confusion, only a balance that did not need to be explained. The fence line held. The gates were closed. The land was as it should be. And yet, everything felt different, not because something had changed outside, but because something had settled within. When they returned to the house, Ethan did not pause this time. He stepped inside without hesitation, moving toward the table where the small tag still rested, catching the morning light, and he picked it up slowly, turning it once in his hand before setting it down again, not returning it to the tin, not hiding it away, just leaving it where it belonged, part of the space, part of the story that no longer needed to be carried alone. The dog watched from its place near the doorway, not approaching, not retreating, just present, and Ethan glanced at it briefly, not with curiosity, not with doubt, but with something closer to respect, the kind that is earned without asking for it. "You were never lost," he said quietly, more to the moment than to the dog. "You were waiting for someone who would not ask you to. Be less than what you are." And the dog held his gaze for a second longer than usual, steady, grounded, and then it looked away, not dismissive, not distant, just complete, as if the words had reached exactly where they needed to go. Outside, the day continued without interruption, the sun rising higher, the wind moving gently across the land, and the house stood as it always had, timber and space and quiet. But now it held something more, something that did not need to be named to be real. Ethan stepped back toward the doorway once more, not out of habit, but because it was where the day began, and the dog joined him without needing to be called, standing beside him in that same place where everything had first aligned. And for a moment, they simply stood there, looking out over the land that no longer felt empty. There were no commands, no expectations, no need to test what had already been proven. Only the quiet certainty of two beings who had found the same understanding from different paths. Ethan let out a final breath, slow and steady, and his shoulders eased fully, not just for the moment, but in a way that suggested something had shifted for good, and he gave a small nod, not to the dog, not to